The rhythmic thunder of the steel mill usually calmed Liz. But today, the vibration of a second, unknown phone hidden in her pocket felt like a countdown to an explosion. High above the factory floor in the cramped cabin of a bridge crane, she watched her husband, Mark, through the reinforced glass. He stood directly beneath a 20-ton ladle of molten iron, glancing nervously at his watch while a stranger handed him a thick, unmarked envelope. A sudden, frantic chime from the secret device in her pocket echoed against the metal walls, and her hand jerked on the controls, sending the glowing, white-hot metal swaying violently over the very man she thought she knew. The air in the cabin tasted of burnt ozone and betrayal as the phone screen lit up with a single message. "He's lying about the money." Below her, the massive hook groaned, a predatory shadow sweeping over Mark's unsuspecting face. Liz's finger hovered over the release lever, her vision blurring from the searing heat and the realization that the life they'd built was melting away faster than the scrap in the furnace. One wrong move would bury the truth in a river of fire. But the real danger wasn't the liquid iron. It was the secret now burning a hole in her uniform. The factory whistle shrieked before dawn, its metallic wail slicing through the thin walls of the apartment. Liz Crawford's fingers twitched against the chipped edge of the nightstand, already counting the seconds until the second blast. Always two, like a warning before the real pain. She rolled onto her side, the mattress groaning under her weight, and pressed her palm against the cold radiator. The heat had died hours ago, leaving only a faint, greasy warmth clinging to the metal. Outside, the city of Gary, Indiana, lay drowned in a bruised violet haze where the silhouettes of the steel mill stacks bled into low-hanging clouds. Liz threw back the heavy wool blanket, the weight of it lifting like a physical burden, and swung her feet onto the linoleum. The floor was ice. A sharp shock that sent a ripple of tremors up her shins, forcing her to find her slippers in the dark. In the kitchen, the faucet coughed up rust-colored water before settling into a weak, uneven stream. Liz filled the kettle, her knuckles brushing against the dent where her brother had slammed it down last winter. The gas stove hissed to life, blue flames licking at the bottom of the pot. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and watched the steam curl upward, thick and slow, like the smoke from the stacks outside. Every movement was a rehearsal of 20 years of mornings. She measured out the coffee grounds, bitter, cheap, and strong, listening to the distant, rhythmic thrum of shunting locomotives in the rail yard. It was a heartbeat, the only one this town had left. She pulled her heavy work boots on, the leather stiff and scarred, and yanked the laces tight. The steel toes felt like anchors. As she zipped her work jacket, the scent of old grease and industrial detergent rose from the fabric, a second skin she could never quite scrub clean. The door to the hallway creaked open. Danny stood there in his too small pajamas, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand. He looked at the kettle, then at her. "You're making coffee again? You want some?" He shrugged, his stomach growling. Liz poured the dark liquid into 2 chipped mugs. The steam carried the smell of burnt beans, a sharp contrast to the stale air of the apartment. Danny wrapped his small hands around the ceramic, seeking the heat. Outside, the first shift trucks rumbled past, their headlights sweeping across the peeling wallpaper. Liz downed her coffee in 3 swallows, the heat searing her throat. A temporary armor against the Indiana winter. "You think they'll fix the heater today?" Danny asked, his thumb tracing the rim of his mug. Liz didn't answer. The whistle shrieked again, longer this time. She grabbed her jacket from the hook, the fabric stiff with factory grime. Danny didn't move. He just stood there, small and still, as if waiting for something she couldn't give him. She stepped out into the hallway, leaving the silence of the house behind for the mechanical roar of the world. The walk to the car was a blur of frost and gray gravel. Mark's old work jacket sat in the laundry basket by the door, a slumped, shapeless thing that smelled of stale tobacco and the mill. Liz reached out to move it, intending to toss it into the washer before the shift started, but her hand snagged on an odd thickness in the lining. She paused, her fingers probing the inner pocket. Usually, Mark kept nothing there but a stray stick of gum or a crumpled receipt. This was different. It was hard, rectangular, and heavy. She reached deep into the lining, her pulse quickening for reasons she couldn't yet name. Her fingers closed around a sleek, cold surface. She pulled it out. A thin black smartphone, brand new, without a single scratch on its glass face. It was nothing like the battered, cracked screen model Mark carried in his holster. Liz stared at the device, the matte finish reflecting the dim hallway light. A sudden floorboard creak from the bedroom. Mark, waking up, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She shoved the phone into the deep pocket of her work trousers, the weight of it pulling at her hip as she hurried out the door. The drive to the plant was a mechanical exercise. She sat in the cab of the truck, the heater blowing lukewarm air, while the black phone burned against her thigh. Once she reached the plant gates, she didn't head straight for the lockers. Instead, she slipped into the women's restroom, the air smelling of bleach and industrial soap, and locked herself in a stall. With trembling fingers, she pressed the power button. The screen flared to life, a brilliant, aggressive blue that made her squint. There was no passcode. The interface opened directly into a messaging app, the notification icon glowing with a red 12. Liz tapped it, her breath hitching. Columns of figures scrolled past, 5-digit sums, dates, and abbreviations for port warehouses. Load secure. One message read, full settlement at North Gate. The names were anonymous, just strings of letters, but the numbers were undeniable. She felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't a mistake, it was a ledger. The phone vibrated in her hand, a new message incoming, and she nearly dropped it. The screen lit up her face, pale and ghostly in the stall's flickering light. She silenced the ringer, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She emerged from the restroom just as Mark was crossing the yard toward the machine shop. He looked ordinary. Tired, his shoulders slightly hunched, his blonde hair thinning at the crown. They met in the canteen for a quick, obligatory breakfast before their separate shifts began. Liz set a plate of eggs in front of him, her hands steady only by a sheer act of will. Mark stirred his coffee, the spoon clinking against the mug with a rhythmic, maddening sound. Faucet still dripping. Mark said, his voice casual, conversational. I'll get to it Saturday. Need to stop by Mom's anyway, see if she needs the gutters cleared. Liz gripped her fork, the metal tines digging into her palm. She watched him lick a stray bit of yolk from his lip, a gesture so familiar it usually brought a sense of comfort. Now, it made her skin crawl. He was lying, not just about the phone, but about the very fabric of their life. Every word about the leaking sink or his mother felt like a layer of ash being spread over a fire. She nodded, unable to find her voice, the hidden phone in her pocket feeling like a piece of live coal against her skin. The shift whistle blew again, the final call. It was a violent, tearing sound that shattered the tension. Liz stood up abruptly, her chair screeching against the tile. Mark looked up, surprised by the sudden movement. You all right, Liz? You're jumping like a cat. Just the shift, she managed to rasp. Late on the quota. She didn't look back as she pushed through the heavy steel doors. The cold air of the yard hit her, but it offered no relief. She pressed her hand against her pocket, confirming the phone was still there. The hard edges, a reminder of the abyss opening beneath her feet. The climb to the crane was a vertical journey through a world of iron and shadow. Liz gripped the cold, grease-slicked handrails of the ladder, her boots ringing out on the metal rungs. 10 meters up, the air changed. It became dry, metallic, and tasted of burnt ozone. She reached the gantry and stepped into the small cab of the bridge crane, the glass windows offering a godlike view of the hellish landscape below. Rivers of molten iron flowed in glowing orange troughs, casting long, dancing shadows against the soot-stained walls. Liz settled into the worn leather seat, the smell of old sweat and hydraulic fluid enveloping her. Her hands moved to the joysticks by instinct. She began the descent of the massive hook, a multi-ton predator dipping toward a ladle of bubbling pig iron. The heat rose in a shimmering wall, searing her face even through the reinforced glass. She had to focus. A millimetric error could tip tons of liquid fire onto the floor, incinerating anyone within 20 yards. But as she hovered the hook, her eyes strayed to the unloading bay. There, standing near a massive concrete pillar, was Mark. He was looking over his shoulder, his posture tense, tapping rapidly on his regular phone. Fury, hot and sudden, surged in Liz's chest. It blinded her more than the glare of the slag. Her hand jerked involuntarily on the left joystick. The massive ladle gave a sickening lurch, the heavy chains groaning as the weight shifted. Below, the shadow of the swinging metal swept over Mark like a shroud. Liz gasped, her heart leaping into her throat, and she slammed the controls back, fighting the momentum. The ladle stabilized, swaying gently, inches from a catastrophic spill. She gripped the levers until her knuckles turned white, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Mark hadn't even noticed. He pocketed his phone and disappeared into the shadows of the maintenance wing. The hours slowed to a crawl. Liz kept her eyes on the floor, but her mind was in the pocket of her trousers. During a lull in the pouring cycle, while the ladle cooled in a holding zone, she pulled out the black phone. It was a violation of every safety protocol, a firing offense. But she didn't care. She scrolled through the messages again, her eyes stinging from the grit in the air. She saw a photo of a stack of cash, bound in bank bands. The anger began to crystallize into something harder, something colder. She took screenshots of everything with her own phone, her hands shaking so much she had to brace her elbows against the armrests. The black phone's battery was dying, the screen flickering before going dark. She shoved it back into her pocket, the weight of the evidence now a weapon she was ready to use. She watched Mark reappear near the loading docks, stepping directly under the path of her next scheduled move. She gritted her teeth. Every maneuver now felt like a targeted strike. She swung the massive crane arm, the shadow of the hook trailing over him like a predator's mark. She led the multi-ton mass of steel within meters of his head, watching him through the glass. He looked so small from up here, so fragile. He was a target on a range, and she held the trigger. As the shift neared its midpoint, Liz saw Mark slip toward the quiet, dimly lit corridor of the repair zone. She made her move. She hit the auto lock on the crane, the magnetic brakes engaging with a heavy thud that vibrated through the cab. She stripped off her headset, the sudden silence of the cab more jarring than the roar of the mill. She scrambled down the ladder, her boots sliding on the greasy rungs. The wind from the massive overhead fans buffeted her, trying to pull her grip loose. She hit the floor with a jolt that vibrated through her teeth and didn't stop to catch her breath. She moved like a ghost through the stacks of finished steel, the smell of fresh rust and oil thick in the air. She found them in the gap between two massive hydraulic presses. Mark was standing with a man she recognized, a floor lead named Miller, a man with a reputation for finding things that weren't lost. Liz pressed her back against the cold, rough surface of a steel sheet, her heart hammering. She watched as Mark reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy bundle wrapped in silver duct tape. Miller took it, his thick, tattooed fingers testing the weight. Liz pulled out her own phone, her fingers fumbling with the camera app. She caught 3 frames: the handoff, the bundle, Miller's face. Then, catastrophe. Her boot caught a discarded tin canister in the shadows. The metallic clang echoed through the bay like a gunshot. Mark spun around, his eyes narrowing as he searched the darkness. Liz froze, her breath held, a single bead of sweat tracing a path down her temple. He stared toward her hiding spot for what felt like an eternity before Miller grunted something and walked away. Mark lingered, looking unsettled. Before turning toward the break room, Liz didn't give him time to settle. She cut through a technical crawl space, her elbows scraping against the soot-covered walls, and intercepted him as he reached the heavy door of the lounge. She stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path. Mark's face went slack, his eyes widening as they caught the flicker of the emergency lights. He tried to brush past her, but she slammed her hand into his chest, pinning him. "Break room, now," she hissed. She grabbed his sleeve and hauled him inside. The room smelled of spilled solvent and stale bottom-of-the-pot coffee. She shoved him in, the doors swinging shut with a groan of ungreased hinges. The roar of the mill was muffled here, replaced by a low-frequency vibration that rattled the bones. Liz didn't waste words. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the black phone, and slammed it onto the plastic table. It skittered across the grease stains, stopping inches from Mark's hands. "Explain the 5-digit deposits, Mark. Explain the North Gate." Her voice was a rasp, lower than he'd ever heard it. Mark looked at the phone as if it were a live grenade. Then he exploded. He didn't cower. He went on the attack. He started shouting, his voice bouncing off the cinder block walls, accusing her of being a spy, of rooting through his things like a dog. He paced the small room, his arms flailing, calling her paranoid, calling her crazy. "You're out of your mind, Liz. You think I'm some kind of kingpin. It's a side hustle. We're drowning." He slammed his fist into the table, making a tin mug jump. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of tobacco and cheap mints. "The accounts are empty, Liz. Do you hear me? Empty. The crypto thing, it didn't just dip, it vanished. The bank is days away from a lien on the house. Days!" He was desperate, his eyes darting. He began to confess, the words spilling out in a frantic, ugly rush. He'd been stealing tungsten electrodes and copper bus bars, high-value scrap that the mill wouldn't miss for months. He was working with the bone men from the North Port, a crew that didn't just break legs, they ended lives. Every overtime shift, every long haul in the truck, it was all a cover. As he spoke, a massive hydraulic press started up on the other side of the wall. The floor began to thrum, a rhythmic, heavy beat that felt like a hammer hitting a coffin lid. Liz looked at him, and for the first time in 20 years, she didn't see the man she'd married. She saw a stranger, a small, frightened thief who had gambled their children's safety for a quick fix. "I did it for us," he yelled over the press. "I did it so we wouldn't lose the roof." "You did it for yourself," she said, her voice cutting through his noise like a blade. "Because you were too proud to tell me you failed." She realized with a sickening jolt that by finding the phone and keeping it, she was already a part of it. If the police raided their house, that phone would be under their mattress. She was an accomplice in a criminal conspiracy that involved the port gangs. She looked at her hands, stained with the black grease of the mill, and saw the hands of a criminal. The door lock clicked as she turned the deadbolt. The sound was final. She turned back to Mark, her face a mask of cold iron. She reached out and grabbed his collar, twisting the fabric until his face was inches from hers. "Who else knows where we live, Mark? Who else knows where the kids go to school?" She shook him, his head snapping back against the wall. Mark's bravado vanished. He began to crumble, his voice dropping to a whimper. He told her about the debt markers, about how their home address was the first line on the collateral sheet. A sudden, violent shudder rocked the building. The sound wasn't the usual rhythmic thump of the machinery. It was a screech of tearing metal, followed by a boom that rattled the teeth in Liz's head. Dust rained from the ceiling, coating her shoulders in gray grit. The break room door flew open, and a wall of scalding white steam billowed in. "The main line!" someone screamed in the corridor. Liz ran to the door. The shop floor was a chaos of white fog and screaming sirens. A steam pipe had burst under high pressure, likely triggered by the erratic movements of the crane she'd left on autopilot. The very machine she commanded had become the engine of their destruction. She saw workers in orange vests being swept off their feet by the force of the blast. The sirens were a physical pain, a pulsing red light that turned the steam into clouds of blood. Liz felt the weight of her error, the distraction, the phone, the anger. It had all led to this. Mark fell to his knees in a puddle of hot condensate, clutching at her trousers, begging her to find the phone, to hide the evidence before the safety teams arrived. "Liz, please, if they find the logs, we're done. Everything is done." She looked down at him with a loathing so deep, it felt like a physical weight. Through the thinning steam, she saw 3 dark silhouettes approaching from the security office. The plant guards, their heavy flashlights cutting through the gloom. They were heading straight for the break room. Liz made a split-second decision. She lunged forward and ripped a heavy bundle from Mark's jacket, the money he'd tried to hide. The duct tape was rough against her skin. She shoved him back into the shadows of the lockers and stepped into the light of the guards' beams. The mill fell into a sudden, vacuum-like silence as the emergency breakers tripped. The only sound was the hiss of escaping gas and the rapid, shallow breathing of the man cowering behind her. Liz looked down at the floor, at the grate where she could see the orange glow of the cooling metal far below. She realized Mark had used her. He'd used her crane schedules, her shift patterns, to time his thefts. She had been his cover, his human stopwatch. Mark stepped out, his face twisted in a mask of desperation. He reached for the phone in her hand, his fist clenched. For a second, she thought he would hit her. The air between them was thick with a new, poisonous energy. "Give it to me, Liz. I'm not going to jail for you." She didn't flinch. She stepped into his space, pressing the phone's screen against his nose. The light showed the debt logs, the photos, the truth. "You're going to the office, Mark," she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "You're going to sign a confession, or I'm sending these files to the feds right now, not tomorrow, now." She didn't raise her voice, but the steel in it stopped him cold. He tried to grab her wrist, but she twisted away, her movements sharp and practiced. She told him that if a single hair on their children's heads was touched because of his debts, she would ensure there was nothing left of him but ash. The fight went out of him. He slumped, his spine turning to water. He began to sob, a pathetic, wet sound that made her want to scrub her skin raw. She didn't wait. She grabbed his arm in a vice grip and hauled him toward the exit. They pushed through the heavy doors into the blinding, cold light of the Indiana morning. The sun was a low, harsh disk that turned the frost-covered parking lot into a field of diamonds. Liz didn't stop until they reached their old Ford F-150. She reached into Mark's pocket and snatched the keys, the metal cold and sharp in her palm. "Get in," she commanded. She climbed into the driver's seat, the engine turning over with a ragged, protesting growl. She looked at the mill in the rearview mirror, the black stacks, the fire, the life she'd known. It was a tomb now. She pulled out of the lot, the truck kicking up a cloud of gray dust. She felt the heavy bundle of cash on the seat beside her, hidden under her jacket. It wasn't for the debt. It was for the lawyers. It was for the new locks. It was for the life she was going to build from the wreckage of his lies. As they hit the highway, the industrial skyline of Gary began to recede. Liz gripped the wheel, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The old Liz, the one who believed, the one who endured, was gone, burned away in the heat of the furnace. The woman driving the truck was made of something much harder. She was made of steel, and she was finally taking the lead.